So we start with these early years in Freud's career. And you can really mark out about 14 years in his career from 1885 to 1899, where Freud develops his meta-psychology that concerns a group of disorders that he calls the Neuro-Psychoses. And among these, you can find neurosis and psychosis. There is a paper published in 1894, as I said, called the Neuro-Psychoses of Defense. And there, Freud states quite clearly and explicitly, as he usually does, that all neuropsychoses begin with an experience that arouses a distressing affect that the subject chooses to forget. The idea that all neuropsychoses begin with this affect that is distressing, that is unpleasurable, and the subject chooses to forget it. Now this, as I said, rings a bell for those of you that are acquainted with the mechanism of repression. So what we see at that point is that Freud says that the neuropsychoses begin with an active form of repression. And Freud says in each of these neuropsychoses, neurosis and psychosis, repression has been shown to be the nucleus of the psychical mechanism. And in each, what has been repressed is the sexual experience in childhood. This is a quote. So we have this similarity between neurosis and psychosis at that point, and Freud relates both of them to something that is associated with repression. But there is a difference. In the case of neurosis, or what we might call neurotic repression, and we can read Freud's later papers about that, but I'll just briefly say that what we see in repression is a detachment of this distressing affect from its accompanying idea. So the idea is detached from the affect, and the idea is pushed or inscribed in the unconscious while the affect remains flowing. And this is a general description of what happens in repression. But Freud says that in psychosis, we see a special method or mechanism of repression that is peculiar to it. And here, and maybe I'll paste the quote here so for you to read. Hope you can see it. I'll read it out loud. Freud says that in psychosis, the subject rejects, and here I emphasize the word in German, verwirft, comes from the word Verwerfung, very important word for us here. So Freud says that the subject rejects the incompatible idea together with its affect and behaves as if the idea had never occurred to the ego at all. From the moment at which this has been successfully done, the subject is in a psychosis. So we see here this mechanism, rejection, in German Verwerfung. And this is the first time that it is mentioned in Freud's corpus. And you'll see that in the progression of his works, he will use different terms to describe this same mechanism at the origin of psychosis. Now, in English, it is translated to rejection. I'll just mention for those of you that are acquainted with the work of Jacques Lacan, and Mike has mentioned that, well, this is the psychoanalytic tradition or orientation that I belong to. So Lacan translates this Verwerfung in his seminar to foreclosure. So those of you that are acquainted with Lacan's theory of psychosis, you can see where he finds its inception in Freud, here in Verwerfung. But back to Freud. So what we see Freud saying about this kind of psychotic rejection is that it is a much more energetic and successful kind of defense than is employed in repression or in neurotic repression. Because while in neurosis, in repression, happening in neurosis, we see a detachment of an idea from a corresponding effect, as I said. And then again, we have this weakened trace of the idea as well as an isolated effect that are left behind. But in psychotic rejection, we have a complete abolishment of all traces of the conflictual idea, as well as its corresponding effect from the psyche. So this is something that leaves no trace behind. Now, Freud gives an example in this paper, and I'll briefly summarize it. He describes an analysand of his that suffers from a disinterest of a certain man that she's in love with. And well, of course, this interest is disagreeable, and Freud says that the analysand attempts to repress this conflictual idea concerning this man, but this idea persists. And Freud says, well, this renders repression ineffective. After this point, Freud says that a specific event where the analysand experiences even stronger disappointment in regard to this man, she progresses into a state of even greater tension, and this brings about the rejection of the reality of his absence. So what we see here is that Freud says that at this point, the analysand passes into a state of hallucinatory confusion, and she starts hearing the voice of this man calling her and feeling his presence by her side. And Freud says, well, this marks the onset of psychosis. Now, in this example, we can see several characteristics of the mechanism of rejection. So we see that first, rejection is a mechanism that is superimposed on a failed repression, according to Freud. This is an interesting point. I'll come back to it later. But what we see here is that the weakened ideas, those that succumb to repression, still persisted in the patient's reality, and only after that they were rejected. Another thing that we see in this perspective is that rejection is a more energetic form of repression. So we see that rejection rejects the conflictual idea and its affect, while repression only pushes the idea into the unconscious and in fact detaches the idea from its affect. And this is why Freud says that rejection is also a break from reality. It rejects a piece of the subject's psychic. The term reality is an extremely problematic one, I think, today. I see many people using this whole notion of reality in Freud, or the reality principle, in a way that I would say is foreign to psychoanalysis. I do not think that we are actually discussing here a reality in that we can call an objective reality, a reality that is really out there in this objective universe. I think that we are talking about a piece of the subject's reality, a piece of psychic reality. And again, I'll make some Lacanian comments from time to time, so bear with me, and I'll try and be very simple when I do. If we think about this in a Lacanian perspective, we think about reality as symbolic reality. And in this sense, psychotic rejection disposes of a piece of the symbolic and not a piece of the objective reality. This piece of the symbolic is something that's very important in terms of its organizing function for one's reality. And this is why we might see the particular psychotic symptoms when we also observe the onset of psychosis. I'll just drop this here for those of you that have some acquaintance with Lacan, and I will talk about this in the next lecture in the series that will engage with Lacan directly. But what we see here in rejection, in Verwerfung, could be in fact found in Lacan as the foreclosure of the signifier of the name of the father. So I'll just put this here. We'll talk about this next time, but for those of you that are acquainted with this, this is where we see this in Freud already. So without this piece of reality, things become a little too real. In the next paper that I talk about, the further remarks on neuropsychosis of defense, Freud talks about the outcome of rejection, and he talks about delusions and hallucinations. And here we have a first presentation or definition of these two elements that will be developed in later papers in Dramatical. But at this point, we see that hallucinations are in fact a unique symptom where reality or psychic reality is restructured around the absence of what was rejection. So in the example, we saw that, let's say, whatever was rejected was a piece of reality that had to do with the rejection of this man, the man rejecting the woman, right? And this was rejected. And then the hallucinations, these voices that this woman was hearing, they revolved around this absence. So Freud says that these might be images and sensations that are associated with a rejected memory, or also words said out loud that are associated with a rejected thought. So this is hallucinations, quite briefly at this point. Now, delusions are described as the projection of feelings of distrust and reproach. So Freud basically says that in neurosis, we see these feelings addressed towards the self. But in psychosis, these feelings are projected outwards towards other people. This might remind you of this particular mode of psychosis called paranoia, where the subject sees the outside world as being persecutory and malevolent. Now, something that is important to note is that later on, Freud is going to object to this thesis, to the idea of projection in delusions, and we'll get to that. And he will provide a different formula that I will elaborate for, very soon. He says, what is abolished from within reappears from without. And this might ring a bell to those of you that are acquainted with, again, with the Lacanian theory of psychosis, where Lacan says that what is foreclosed from the symbolic reappears in the real. So what we're talking about is a certain, let's say, libidinal cathaxis that is rejected and then returns in reality. This is an interesting way, by the way, I'll just make a side note, to distinguish between forms of psychosis in the Lacanian orientation. Because what we say in the Lacanian orientation is that in psychosis, a jouissance escapes and returns in the real. Now, in order to distinguish, for instance, paranoia and schizophrenia, two forms of psychosis, Éric Laurent offers to think of it as two different modes of reappearance of this libido. In case of paranoia, what is rejected returns in the other, in the social world, in the world around the subject, in the TV, in the radio, in all these people around this subject which are involved with this form of enjoyment that's tormenting the subject. In schizophrenia, we'll see this form of enjoyment return in the body. So in the fragmentation of the body, in these fantasies of the death of the body and the deteriorization of the body. And I'll just say, those of you that maybe know my work, that I work a lot on the study of autism. And in autism, we say that this enjoyment that is rejected returns in the rim, on the rim of the body. This is something that I've been working on for the past few years, and I've published some paper on. So, but today we're not going to talk about that. So this is generally the gist of this first paradigm. Again, I will only talk for about an hour today. So we'll present things, and hopefully this will raise some curiosity among some of you, and you can go to Freud and keep on reading. So we can say that this is the first paradigm that Freud provides for us as his way to understand psychosis.